The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for another webinar in the Food Industry Executive webinar series. Super excited to have all of you here today to learn from the Aptium team about how you can fight food waste with supply chain sustainability. A couple housekeeping items to keep in mind. If you have any questions at all, please drop those into the chat. We will be answering those at the end of the webinar. And also, thank you again so much for joining us. We're super excited today. To start off, I'd like to introduce Jack Payne, who is a Director of Solutions Consulting, Food and Beverage at Aptean, focusing on food and beverage ERP. Payne originally joined the organization nearly 30 years ago with Ross ERP and spent much of that time working closely with the manufacturers to understand their challenges. And over the years, Payne has collaborated with customers, industry analysts, and developers to create a strong vision for the Aptean's ERP solution, and has become a well-respected industry resource for best practices and future technology advancements. And with that, I would pass it over to Jack Payne to present how you can fight food waste with supply chain sustainability. Thanks, Jack, for joining us.
Hey, thank you, and I'm excited to be here today as well. And as I talk about different topics in the food industry, supply chain sustainability is one of those exciting topics that I really enjoy talking about. Because I realize I can make a difference. Each one of us individually can make a difference, and the various companies that we work with and provide information to can all make a big difference in the sustainability efforts of supply chain. So again, I echo the same thing. Thanks for being with us today. Just a little bit of background about Aptean before we get into our topic. We provide mission-critical, industry-specific software solutions, with food and beverage being one of our top key strategic solutions. We have over 400 million in revenues, 2,600 employees, around a third of those employees dedicated 100% to food and beverage, and over 1,000 customers of ours that are in the food and beverage industry. And we try to support customers throughout the full supply chain, whether they're in the growing and packing operation, the processing, or the distribution operation, to support the full food and beverage supply chain all the way from farm to fork, as well as be able to provide solutions for all different sizes of companies within the food and beverage space. One of the things we also offer that we like to talk about is what we call the Aptean Advantage. Our core solution, our core application is the mainstream ERP solution as your system of record. But technology does not stop at just ERP. There are lots of other needs that technology can have, whether it's e-commerce or payment portals and payment platforms. Many people in the food and beverage industry work through electronic data interchange or EDI. So being able to provide a full host of complementary solutions that are all fully integrated into the ERP application is something that we do provide as a differentiator. But enough about Aptean. Let's get into talking about food sustainability today. We're going to start off with talking a little bit about some of the industry trends and see where sustainability falls within those trends. We'll get into talking about sustainability. What is sustainability? The biggest detractor to sustainability is food waste. We'll talk about that. And then we'll get into, well, what are the solutions? What are the things that can be done to reduce the waste, which in turn improves our sustainability efforts? And we will have our question and answer session at the end of today. In late 2020, we commissioned Reuters News Service to do a survey for us of over 300 industry executives in the food and beverage space, as well as thought leaders within the space, to understand not only what the trends are, but how had the pandemic affected what was going on in the food and beverage industry and how it had affected the trends. Now, I want to share a few of those with you today, which will help us lead us into our discussion about sustainability. So as we ask the question to these executives, tell us the top 3 things that you think are going to impact the food industry the most. That's why the numbers add up to more than 100%. That should be adding up to around 300%. Tell us the top 3 things with this. In my opinion, The top two are basically tied for one, 64-62%. Changing consumer demands came in at number one. Sustainability came in at number two. But all of us in the food industry know about traceability and recall and food safety capabilities. This is still coming in at a strong number three with this. Also, if we were to dig deeper into changing consumer demands, some of those consumer demands are also about sustainability. So we're getting sustainability both in consumer demands and sustainability by itself. We also ask a similar question in terms of what do they think were the biggest threats they would be facing over the next 5 years. And interesting enough, it kind of flip-flopped a little bit here. Sustainability and environmental impact came in a solid number one at 25%. And again, this was based upon 100%. Number two and number three were tied. Changes in consumer trends and habits and lagging behind in digital transformation. And I think the pandemic heightened the awareness for the need for digital transformation. And then the concerns about lagging behind is one of the fears or one of the threats. But again, today we're here to talk about sustainability and how we can provide supply chain excellence to address sustainability and to improve our sustainability in the food supply chain. Also, we want to look a little more short term, not just over the next 5 years. What is your specific priority focus in the next 2 years? Sustainability also came out on top as that number one focus, followed by food safety and traceability and talking and thinking about blockchain to connect all the dots all the way from the farm to the fork or to the consumer. So that kind of brings us to the topic, what is food sustainability? And a few years ago, before I started really understanding what this was and thinking about it, my first thought was, okay, this is all about using recyclable packaging, because we kept seeing recyclable materials, recyclable packaging, but it's a lot more than just doing recyclable packaging in terms of what is sustainability. So today, before we get into the topic, we do have two poll questions we're going to do. And our first poll question, I'd like to turn it over for that.
Thanks, Jack. Here you'll see our first poll. What do you think about when you hear food sustainability? So there's a few options here, using recyclable and recycled packaging, selecting healthy foods, reducing food waste, providing enough food for the world, and all of the above. So take just a couple of minutes to think about this and cast your votes, and then I will share the results shortly. All right, just a few more seconds here. All right. So it looks like we had a pretty healthy split. 22% responded with reducing food waste, 9% said providing enough food for the world, and 70% in the winner was all of the above.
So thank you. I think this was almost a trick question because I think all the answers were correct answers. They're all part of food sustainability. And if you were to Google, which is now a mainstream term, if I was to do a Google search on what is food sustainability, you will get a lot of different answers back, very much with the same answers that we had within the poll with this. Sustainable agriculture for healthy food without compromising future generations, choosing foods that are helpful to our environment and our bodies, nurturing of the food and the animals and the land and the community, enough food to maintain the human population. So all of these are food sustainability. And it's more than the food itself. So as I started learning more about this, I said, well, which of these is the quote, the proper answer for food sustainability? And I kind of settled on my choice being what the United Nations has given us in terms of food sustainability, which I think is a holistic view, all encompassing, taking into fact consideration of all of these factors. And I'm not going to read it all to you, but they point out three basic things in terms of food security and nutrition that takes into consideration economic, social, and environment for current and future generations is not compromised. So it needs to be profitable to people that are involved in food. There's a certain social element to it as well, that it benefits society, as well as the environmental, so it either has a positive or a neutral impact on the environment with us. So this is saying quite a lot. So how can we assist in the effort for food sustainability to ensure that not only our generation, but not only our children's generations, but their children's and their children's going on does have sustainable food as the population of the world increases and as the farm space seems to continue to decrease with this. So how can we have this food sustainability? They also put together a map of this, so to speak, and showing how the overlap between the economic, the social, environmental, in terms of getting green growth, inclusive growth, eco-sociological progress, all provides together to give us our sustainability within our food systems. Maybe a little bit more than you were looking for today, but just want to kind of set the stage in terms of what is food sustainability, and also what is the biggest contributing factor to achieving food sustainability today, and that is our food waste that we have. And it kind of seems maybe a little bit ironic that we're trying to achieve sustainability, but there is quite a lot of waste that's going on in the supply question. So this is our second and final poll question for today that we'd like to get your input on.
All right, thanks again, Jack. Our second question is, what percent of food is wasted globally? 8%, 15%, 24%, 33%, or 42%. So go ahead, cast your votes, and I will be back shortly with the results. All right, just a few more seconds here. Okay, so it looks like nobody voted for 8, 15, or 24%. 73% said 33%, and 27% of the audience said 42%.
So it sounds like we've got a very educated audience with us today who already knows their stuff about food waste that we're facing with the world. In fact, in just a moment, we're going to find both of those answers are correct answers depending upon what you're looking at. But again, these are estimates that have been done by various organizations with this. So food waste is very expensive. We've already established, or we've talked about it being very excessive, but it's also harmful to the environment. Not just the growing of the food, but the waste of the food becomes harmful to the environment. So the estimate is across the world, 1/3 of the world's food is wasted. And this third is equivalent to $1 trillion US. And just for comparison's sake, the total spend in the United States for food through all sources of food is about $1.7 trillion. So we think, more than half of that is wasted globally. 1.3 billion tons. And I have a hard time understanding how much is 1.3 billion tons. How about 26 100 billion pounds. That is a lot of food that's wasted, that's going into landfills. In the United States, the estimate is up to 40% of the food is wasted. 1,200 calories a day is wasted. And, looking at the typical calorie intake, depending upon age and other situations, if we consider 2,000, that's quite a lot of food per day. $2,200 per household. But then the part that gets more, I guess, sad with this is 2/3 of that food that is wasted is actual edible food. It's not that it's spoiled food or contaminated food, but it is edible food, and $161 billion of wasted food in the United States. So any kind of improvement that we can make on this is going to have significant improvement in improving our sustainability. But not only are we talking about the food that's wasted all the way through the food supply chain, it's all the other resources that are wasted as well when we have food that goes into the landfills. So almost 20% of the croplands, almost 20% of the agricultural water, almost 20% of the farming fertilizer is waste. The results of the growth of the farms is going into the landfills. It is the #1 contributor by weight of the landfills, as well as the greenhouse gas emissions and the methane emissions coming from this. So every pound of food that we can reduce also has less resources to grow the food, as well as less content to the landfill. So what types of foods are wasted? How much money do we spend on those different types of food? So globally, if you start thinking about this, it kind of makes sense. Fruits and vegetables tend to have the shortest shelf life. They're typically not as expensive as meat and dairy products. So those tend to be a higher percentage. So if you think about it, almost 50% of the fruits and vegetables grown globally are wasted. They don't make it, into the consumer. A large portion, almost 1/3 of fish and seafood, almost 30% of cereals. And then when we get to dairy products and meat and poultry, approximately 20%. Again, these are various estimates and studies. It's going to vary based upon the type of meat, the type of dairy, the type of fruits and vegetables. But some pretty big numbers here, some pretty astounding numbers. In the United States, how much do we waste by dollar amount? Again, the vegetables is the highest, but right behind it from a dollar standpoint is dairy and meat. And I imagine the percentages is about the same in the US as globally, that 20% of meat, which is 23 billion in the US, is equivalent to that 45% of fruits and vegetables. That's about 30 billion. So again, that dollar per pound falls into it with this. So a lot of areas that we can think about and how we can reduce the waste with that. So that really takes us to what I think is the meat of today is what can we do to provide excellence in our supply chain so that we can address the amount of waste that we have, as well as other things from a sustainability effort with this. And when I talk about our food supply chain, always starts at the farm. And I spent a lot of time trying to think about this and saying, well, is there any food that we, consume, that we eat does not start at the farm? I come up with a couple examples, but even those examples I come up with, there has to be a harvesting process or some type of gathering process. And so the two examples that first come to mind are things like minerals, salt, the largest mineral that we have that we consume. We don't farm salt, but we mine salt and we harvest salt for use. Okay, so that is a farming practice that we have to have. And then seafood, there is, seafood that is raised. There's also the wild caught seafood. So we are not growing that, so to speak. The earth is growing that, but we are harvesting it through our fishing practices with this. I've had some other people suggest things such as maybe food dyes and some other food type chemicals that might not come from a farm, but but these would typically be minor. But basically, everything is coming from the farm, whether it goes directly from the farm to distribution or maybe direct to the table, whether it's a restaurant. But a lot of the food also goes to processing for the mixing and the cooking and the baking and the packing and then distribution. So the 4 key steps, the 4 key elements in our supply chain. And we've also had studies done as to say, well, where is the food waste occurring? And again, this is going to vary based upon the type of product, based upon the specific farm, the specific processing facility, the specific distribution facility. Even when we get to consumers, different homes, some homes may be higher food waste than other homes just because of what they're doing. But what I'm going to show you, I'm going to call it just really kind of general numbers that kind of averaged across this. But it is, fairly well recognized that half of the food waste comes from the consumption side. Whether it's in homes or whether it's in restaurants or food service, that about half of our food waste comes from here. Those are things that we can do as individuals for consumption we'll talk about. But then depending upon where we are employed at or where we have focus in the supply chain, whether it's farm, that could be from 6 to 8%, processing could be from 6 to 10%, distribution and retail from 4 to 6. And of the distribution and retail, maybe I've unfairly put this together. Most of it's occurring in the retail space, not as much in the distribution space. But a lot of this in the retail space is based upon consumer preferences that could have reduced that from a retail standpoint. So let's take these and talk about them. But before we do that, I also wanted to validate this information as well too. And I went back to an article that was published by the UN earlier this year in March, talking about the amount of food waste, and where they are saying it's about 33% food waste, they are confirming that half of the food waste occurs from the consumption. They're saying 17% homes, restaurants, and shops. And they also say over a third of food is never eaten, so that gives us that information. Then also, it says that of the 17% that occurs in households, 11%, which is, again, 2/3 of that, in round numbers, is good food. It's food that can be eaten. That's just wasted with this. So again, just some numbers to confirm or reaffirm what we're looking at. And what would be the effect of being able to reduce the food waste? So statistics were that in the U.S., 1 in 6 Americans don't know where their next meal is coming from. And if we could just divert 15% of the waste that we're having, so 15% off the 40, which is 6%, that would reduce the number of food insecure Americans by 50%. Diverting a third of it would feed all Americans that we have today. And we should know that 2/3 of consumers is good food with this. It starts becoming a logistics problem in how we handle this. Globally, 1 in 9 are facing starvation. So food insecure and starvation are 2 different things. But globally, starvation, 1 in 9 or 690 million people are hungry. And if we could reduce the food waste by 27%, that could feed the world's population. Again, it becomes a supply chain logistics problem of how do we distribute the food to this. But it's reassuring to me to know that the resources that we have available to us today, we do have the resources to be able to feed the world. It's just that we just need to be able to reduce the waste and figure out the supply chain to be able to reduce the hunger with this. And also, UN has put out what they call a hunger map. But also one of the things that said is, the food waste that you would think in the areas that are considered hunger areas would be less. But they basically said it's about the same, no matter where you're at, whether you're in a nation that has considered to be wealth or whether you're in a nation from a poverty standpoint, that the amount of food waste is fairly equivalent across all of these. So what are the contributing factors to the waste throughout the supply chain, and what can be done about the waste with this? So if we look at what's happening at the farms, and everything's coming from the farm, so for the crops that we grow with this, there's what's called the pre-harvest waste. We're getting poor yields with this, and it may be that in addition to farming practices, it could be improved. It may be other factors affecting it, such as weather, whether it's storms or droughts that's occurring, or insect damage that may be occurring with this, that we're giving less yield from this, as well as looking at ways that we can have better farming practices. There's lots of crops that go unharvested in the field. It may be that because we know there's going to be waste, we know there's going to be yield loss, we're not sure what the weather is going to be. There's over-planting. From the over-planting, that is not harvested. Last year, we saw the situation of combination of things, labor shortages and harvesting some of the crops. We also saw problems with the supply chain and how the supply chain turned upside down for a period of time, almost everything exclusively going to the homes and not going through food service. And this caused some challenges as well with food in the field not being able to be harvested because the channel that was going to was not there. This is quite an interesting one. Unsellable product. I've heard it called other things, but to be politically correct, I'm trying to use the term imperfect produce, imperfect vegetables. And this is just an example of some I've seen with this. Some of the different carrots that we have here are different peppers and all. They may not look as pretty, but from a nutritional standpoint, they're just as good. But if I go to the store as a consumer, and if I was to see the carrot in the upper left, I probably wouldn't buy that carrot. I probably want to buy a carrot I'm used to with this. A lot of these can go into food processing, where you had carrots and vegetables going into it. But a lot of this either does not get harvested on the farm, or either goes into retail, maybe not as imperfect as this, but goes into retail, and as consumers, because we like to pick out our vegetables or like to pick out our meats rather than someone else picking that out for us, we may bypass this, and it may spoil in the retail area with this. So there are, various technology, various applications. I've mentioned farming practices. One of the problems sometimes with the farms are lack of connectivity, lack of cellular or lack of Wi-Fi connectivity in large farms with this. And there are now applications that have been built that use Bluetooth, so that if you're in a harvesting process with a combine, all combines today typically come with a tablet with this, and the tablet is for being able to diagnose and look at the maintenance records on that particular piece of farm equipment. But it has Bluetooth with this, and you can connect this up. So if you're doing harvesting and you're dumping this into a trailer being pulled by a tractor, you may have scales on the trailer doing this. You can have Bluetooth that's collecting the information. And then once you get back to the barn or in range with the barn, within network capable range, is then collecting this information. So why is this important to us? So this way we can track what our yields are. We can look at analytics and see where we're using good farming practices, how we can improve that yield the next time. We can look at things like what's the weather has done to our yields. So these are technology things that we can bring into our farming practices to help us reduce the waste, as well as better planning in terms of demand all the way through the supply chain, so we're not over planning with this. And so hopefully we can plan better for our labor requirements, and also looking at other channels of being able to use this imperfect produce and vegetables. There's also handling, storage, packaging waste. This does occur from time to time as well, but a lot of this is we can look at how this can be handled. We had one of our customers who was in the farming practice. And when they started looking at the amount of packaging they were using, they realized that 50% of what they were buying was going into packaging, and most of it was non-recyclable packaging. So they completely re-engineered their packaging into less packaging, but still packaging that would protect the fruits and vegetables they were growing, and that would also recycle packaging. So this was a great contribution they had to reducing the waste with that, what we call post-harvest waste. As we get into processing, you know, anywhere from 6 to 10%, could be less than 6 in some cases, could be more than 10 in other cases. But from my experience in working in processing companies and working with processing companies for over 20 years, you know, I categorize the waste that occurs there into 3 primary categories: processing waste from either scrap or rejects, reduced yields, and storage and handling waste. And so in the scrap and rejects, as you're batching products together, you're mixing the various products, there are errors, you know, not having the proper controls, or putting too much of one ingredient or not enough of another ingredient, or putting an ingredient that shouldn't occur in this, or something causing contamination to the batch that has occurred with this. And then allergens, for those factories that deal with the allergens, you know, this is also a concern, and part of the food safety program is to be able to manage those allergens. And so if we happen to substitute an ingredient that goes into the batch that has an allergen that should not be contained in it, we have just contaminated the batch with the allergen from this. So this is where I think a lot of the waste is coming from, is from batching errors. We'll talk away in a few minutes about how we can improve that. Yields is another area that I get very interested in, and there's a lot of payback, a lot of benefits to reducing yields with this, or improving our yields, reducing our waste. So just having excess usage with waste, you know, using more than is needed, just to make sure. If you're in the meat industry and you're doing cooking of meat products, you could be overcooking and shrinking. We had a customer that we worked with where we started managing and measuring their yields, and what we found out was they were overcooking their product. And just that amount of overcooking they were doing, in terms of revenue dollars to the bottom, not to the bottom line, but in terms of revenue, they were losing over $1 million in revenue by overcooking the meat and reducing the yield. So by not overcooking it, you know, cooking it to the proper food safe temperatures, they were able to pick up an extra $1 million because of reducing the shrinkage, which is yield. And then giveaway in packaging. You know, many of the products, there is a published weight or volume on those products, and you know, there's variation in filling and packing, whether it's a liquid in a bottle or whether it's a solid in a box or a jar or a can or whatever. And so we have to set our equipment to make sure that we're always over that minimum. But as we can start controlling that, you know, we can bring that that giveaway down. That's just money out the door with that giveaway. And you know, throughout the supply chain, there's storage and handling damage that occurs, expired lots. It may be that as we get product into the factory for processing, whether it's ingredients or finished goods, there's expiration of that, the spoilage that can no longer be used. So what are different ways that we can address this? And you know, one of the simple ways I've seen is instituting barcode scanning, so that as you're doing the batching process, and it may be a 2-step process where there's a weighing or a kitting process where all of the, I'm gonna call it the minor ingredients, are typically going to be weighed or kitted out per batch, and they're recorded from that. And then as we actually do the batching, is barcoding each one of those to make sure that we're putting in the right ingredients, the right quantities of these, to prevent those errors in batching, to make sure that we're not putting in non-allowed allergens. If we've had a substitute ingredient coming in, to make sure that substitute ingredient does not have that non-allowed allergen. Maybe taking a step further to provide real-time plant floor instruction through MES systems. A lot of times the batching logs or the batching instructions are paper-based, and because they're making the same products, every week, could be the same products every day. You know, you may get used to it. You may get a little bit haphazard and you know, not completely checking this. But if we put this into an MES system, it provides step by step. It provides the operator. Or as we get into virtual reality type glasses that has instructions for the operators, telling them what to do as they're doing it and verifying it. You know, this is all digital transformation, digital technology that is now available, and it is real world things we can do. Also, from a planning and scheduling standpoint, of improved scheduling for our allergens. And I always use the peanut example. So if we're making products that have peanuts in that, is you're making the schedule so that we're putting all those peanut products at the end of the run, the end of the shift, end of the day, however you're doing your scheduling with this, so that we reduce the chance of that contamination for that peanut allergen to a product that would travel or come after that, so that we have the proper sequencing from that. Giveaway is one of my favorite ones to talk about. We've already talked about the reduction in the shrinkage from the overcooking, bottling lines, bottling facilities. You know, it's always nice when you have that little extra amount of drink in the bottle over the 16 ounces, the 500 milliliters, whichever you're buying. But I've also seen situations where, you know, we've tried to reduce the bottle thickness, and it becomes very easy that if that bottle is overfilled, it's very easy for it to squeeze out on you. And I've actually had products that I have not bought that I used to like, but I bought a different brand just because I knew that bottle typically was always overfilled. So not only they're losing money on loss of yield, they're losing money on the customer not buying it because of that overfilling with that. But having systems that can do real-time tracking and real-time measurement of this, so that if you're doing, you know, 16 ounces, and maybe you set your equipment to do 16.1, because you know from a bell curve it typically varies over, you know, a 0.2 ounce range. So you've got the statistics going on where you do that all the bottles are going to be between 16 and 16.2 ounces. Well, how can we work to narrow that bell curve? Is it through better equipment maintenance? Is it better measurement, better controls? How can we reduce that, say, from 0.2 ounces to 0.1 ounces? So now instead of setting our equipment at 16.1, we set our equipment at 16.05. In effect, we're able to reduce our yield by about 2/3 by being able to do that. So a lot of ways to save money, reduce yield. And then storage and handling. And one of the things that we typically experience whenever we are working with a new customer and we're implementing data collection or barcode scanning, and they have a freezer or cooler, primarily a freezer involved. You know, one of the things we have to do is go through that freezer, or go through all the inventory, you know, count everything, put a barcode label on everything. We always find an expired product in the back of that freezer, you know, because it's hard to get to. They don't want to spend as much time in it. Those, you know, not accurate inventory management by expiration date. So we want to be able to do that. And we want to use a term that we call FIFO, first expiry, first out. Not first in, first out, but first expiry. And this can apply to ingredients coming from maybe two different suppliers. Same ingredient, you can use either one, but maybe your first receipt is today from supplier A. Your second receipt is tomorrow from supplier B. So FIFO is going to tell you, take the one that you received today, but it could be the one that you received tomorrow has a shorter shelf life remaining, so you want to use that one first, and having systems that do that for you, that you don't have to do that. But also getting back to planning, starting with demand planning and having accurate planning of what you think that demand is going to be, so that just like an over planning in the farm, we're not overproducing within the factory with this, so that we don't have that excess inventory that we have to either sell for a lower price, or that excess inventory that spoils and we don't sell to anyone from this. And then as we get into the distribution side of it, and a lot of this is similar to what we're seeing in processing. It's the handling, it's the shelf life, it's the expiration. It's having the good inventory, the warehouse management systems that can manage our inventory, can manage our shelf life, that can have, again, good forecasting, good planning with this, so that we're planning the right inventory. Now, demand planning has been a challenge for everybody the last 18 months because that demand stream from consumers has shifted than what it was in the beginning of 2020. So that's been quite a challenge. But then the next is as we get into the retail and the spoilage, and this is a typical retail produce that you go into that, as a consumer, I can come out and I can select whatever I want. And so I'm going out and I'm looking, I'm picking up, and I'm taking the best. And I remember years ago, when I was in high school and working in a small market such as this, I remember the owner of the market saying, you put all the apples out, you put all the other produce out, and the customer's going to come in, they're going to pick out the one that looks the best for them. The next customer's then going to pick out the best, and so forth and so on with this. And then what happens at the end is that that one that's that imperfect fruit or that imperfect vegetable kind of gets left and it becomes spoiled. And typically, you have to do something with that. Personally, I kind of like picking out my own vegetables, but again, it's something I would have to learn to change and do with that. But having good, accurate demand planning for our retail establishments with this, as well as food service, is going to help us in that retail waste. But in the home, this is something we all can do. 2/3 of the food is consumed in the home. 1/3 of it is consumed in restaurants. Now, this was pre-pandemic, so will we ever get back to this? We're slowly trying to come back, but 40% of that waste of that 50%, so half of our food waste is occurring at the consumption level. 40% of that, or let's say 80% of that, is occurring at the homes. 20% of that's occurring in food service. So there's more waste, per pound of food consumed in the homes with this. And just first of all, understanding this and learning this is something I've tried to look at myself and just actually be aware of the amount of food that I'm wasting. It starts with, first of all, not doing smart buying. Second is, maybe I change my mind after I buy something, or maybe I buy a pack of hamburger buns that's 8 and I only use 4 of those, but the other 4 are good. Well, I found that if I freeze those buns, that hey, they're very good. I can thaw them out in just a few minutes, and they're good for me 2 weeks from now with this. So, smart shopping in what you're doing, planning your meals out, being aware of what food you have before it's going to, quote, spoil, and donating that to food banks or shelters. And I know there've been some changes with that and restrictions that we've had to kind of live with and learn to live with in the past. But as we, again, try to get back to normal, something we can do. But researching the best way to store perishable food items. Bread, where's the best place to store bread? So that we do that. But also one of the things, and this is something the industry is doing, is the difference in best before and use by dates. Expiration dates that people call them on food is not something that's typically mandated by the FDA. It's only for a couple of items like baby food, baby formula. This is something that was started by the food companies, that as consumers that we started seeing this and we started liking this and we started requesting this on every food that we buy. When I go into the grocery store to buy my food and I'm buying bread, I'm looking around to get the one that has the longest one that says used by or best before date on it, so that I know I'm not going to consume it all. So I'm part of the problem there. But also, when it says best before, does that mean it's spoiled? In most cases, it does not mean it's spoiled. It just may mean that some of the flavor, or some of the texture, or something from that may not be as good with that. But buying, frozen foods or freezing fresh foods before they expire so that we can use those. Also, reducing our consumption of meat and fish and dairy because there's a lot of waste in this from a dollar standpoint. So these are all some of the things that we can do as consumers to help out through the supply chain. But again, I think first of all, being aware of the biggest detractor to achieving sustainability, or making sure that we have sustainability in our food supply chain. And then looking at, no matter whether we're at the farm or the processing or the distribution, or the biggest problem being consumers, that we all do our part to be able to have excellence in our sustainability, so that we have, nutritious food and safe food for our generation and future generations to come. So thank you today for allowing me to present this to you. And now we're to our point for our question and answer period.
All right. Thank you so much, Jack, for that. We did have a quick housekeeping question that I can tackle right now. It was just a question where will there be a handout of the slides? And yes, there will be. We will send out the link to the recording as well as the slide deck here in the next few days. So the next question after that is, what metrics can companies look at to analyze their sustainability practices?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think the first thing is just, first of all, let's say doing a survey, looking at and being aware of what you're doing. So just like food safety is, food safety starts with that survey of where, there is the ability to have problems, and defining that as critical control points. So then we want to look at, well, what are the metrics we can look at? So let's say that you're in processing. We want to look at several metrics. We want to look at how much expiration that we're having. Is the expiration occurring in raw materials? And is it because we're ordering the wrong product? Is it because our suppliers not giving us enough shelf life on what we order? And are we ordering the wrong product because we don't have the proper planning systems? Maybe has our product mix changed and we haven't gone through and reset minimum inventories, those kind of things. So let's look at expiration. I think looking at yields, and not just being able to look at, I'm going to call it factory yield, from how many pounds come in the receiving dock and how many pounds ship out of the shipping dock, but taking it and breaking it down into yield by step. Are we having yield loss in the batching? Are we having yield loss in the cooking example like we looked at? Are we having yield loss in packaging? Is this yield loss due to giveaway? Also damage, and also looking at maybe training and culture, or is it material handling equipment that needs improvement? So I think first of all, we have to measure it to know where we're at. We have to understand what are the reasons, so we need to be able to track those. And then we need to continue to measure it on an ongoing basis and try to determine the problems, what's causing this, so that we can then reduce the amount of waste that we have. Again, this is for processing, but again, if you're either in the farm growing side or in the distribution side, again, looking at those control points and defining what those metrics are and tracking it.
All right, great. Next question. As a nationwide distributor, what is the best method to donate food that's damaged or close to expiration date?
Well, that's a good question. I think it depends upon if you're nationwide. I'm assuming you have multiple distribution facilities, and you probably would need to look at that locally, whether it's food banks or homeless shelters or something of that nature as well, and basically setting up some kind of relationship with them to make those donations. I don't know if those would be like weekly donations or looking at other things as well. I think that's just a great social type question to ask. And I think the two parts to it, that you don't want to, let's say, hide the problem, but I think that when you do have food that's damaged or close to expiration date, let's find a way that this food can be used. But also, let's look at why we're having food that's being damaged, or why we're having food that's getting close to expiration date. Let's try to minimize that as well too. Not trying to be unconcerning, but also trying to look at the big picture as, anything like we can donate, but also let's try to solve the problems and not just push it under the rug or sweep it under the rug, as they say.
All right, thank you. Next question. Are there ways to still eat meat products while still promoting sustainability?
Oh, of course, yes. And I was investigating this a while back, not so much for sustainability, but more for health practices. And from what I found from that is, particularly in the United States, for those of us that are meat eaters, that we typically were eating more meat at a meal or at a sitting that our bodies could digest. And I think it's always tempting to go out to restaurants, and I almost chuckle now if I do ever get to go back to a restaurant, but I have been to a couple, where they bring out the big 52-ounce tomahawk steak. Nobody should even consider eating that. It should be like a group of 10 people eating it or whatever. So yes, I think it's really more about making sure the portion size, not only for sustainability, but also for health as well, I think it's great.
All right, great. Next question. Are you still able to donate food even if it's close to its expiration date?
Well, and that gets into the labeling of the food. There's very little food that actually says expiration dates on it. Most of it says sell by date, best before date, use by date, which is just a suggested best with this. There are certain foods that either they have a smell or a look or an odor. So like if I had bread that was past its use by date, but it had mold on it, that's something I would not use or would not be able to donate or provide to someone from that. So I think, again, it's education that we need to have, but also it's looking at the industry or looking at the regulations and trying to come up with some kind of standardization of the dates, the date labels that we have on various foods. With that, I think is part of the challenge that we need to look at.
All right, next question. What are some ways businesses can make small but effective changes that will make a big impact?
One of the first things I think is just awareness training. Training employees on the importance of this. I think sometimes there's so much focus on efficiency and moving fast, but as a result, there's damage in handling. And I think a certain amount of this is accepted. And again, there has to be a proper balance between reducing the damage and efficiencies within operations. So let's look at also equipment maintenance. I think a lot of it just starts with training and awareness, and then from that, whenever we have food loss, food waste, is really trying to determine what is the reason that we had this, what's the root cause, so then we can attack the root cause. It does not require a large investment in technology. Technology may be something that helps out, justify once we determine the root cause for this, but there are a lot of things that can be done from an awareness and culture that can help us.
Okay, great. How can companies use technology to support sustainability efforts?
So this is where we get into talking about what I call digital transformation. We didn't really get into that today, talking about it, what this is, but digital transformation is really a business transformation using technology to help us with this. So it involves, having, first of all, a central system, system of record. It involves the ability to collect data, whether that's barcode scanning of data, whether that's digital collection with IoT or other things. But once we collect the data, how do we analyze the data? Collecting the data is not what we're trying to do. It's trying to get information for better decision making. So to me, those are the three foundation elements of digital transformation: is the business system that collects information you need, is the ability to collect that information, not having to collect it manually. But then how do you analyze that information? How do you understand it? So a couple times I've mentioned, we need to analyze and find out what is the reason that we're having this. So if we can collect what our yields are, just like on the cooking example, we're collecting what the temperatures are of the ovens, the length of time of the ovens, what's the internal temperature of the product coming out, what's the weight of the product going in, what's the weight of the product coming out, and realizing that from doing this measuring, that our yield loss, our shrinkage in this case, was too great. And the amount of shrinkage actually totaled up to be quite a lot of money from this, so that we're basically overcooking the product. So having tools that can do this for us without us having to manually collect the data to get to that conclusion is really what I think how technology can really help us, but also make sure that once we get to that, is tell how we're cooking the meat, or how we're filling the bottles, or how we're doing the batching to reduce the waste.
All right, we have a couple of more questions. How can a company address post-sale food waste? Packaged food that isn't brought in by the consumer and can't be sent back to the production facilities because of refrigeration standards.
That that is a tough question to try to figure out the answer to. I think it really starts though with what I'm going to call planning, so that we have proper demand planning systems, so that we are planning for what we're purchasing, we're planning for inventory. And that's been a challenge with the pandemic because our whole supply chain has changed. The dynamics of where we're eating food at has changed. The USDA has some good information on their website that in the two broad categories they break it down into is how much food is consumed at home, how much food is consumed away from home, and then also what are those individual channels that have fed that. And if you go back and look at what's happened between 2019 and 2020, you can see a big shift. I think we all know it, but you can see a big shift in the amount of increase of food that's being bought for use at home, and then the food that's being bought to support us away from home, and then the increases and reductions from that. So I know that has really upset the supply chain. That's has upset demand planning that we've done, but having information so that we can be agile as we learn things, as we get back to normal, so that we're not lagging behind 6 months or 9 months. And being agile, I think, can help us out in this continued period of uncertainty that we're in.
All right, thank you. And I know we have a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask you one last question. Efforts need to be made to educate grocery stores about things like buying vegetables within size ranges because they're easier to price. That causes huge losses at the grower level. Is this on the radar?
I think some channels it is, some different grocery stores is probably on the channel, but basically, if you're that big box grocery store, so to speak, and typically, you're the one that's making the demands back to the supply chain with this. And I think they're looking at it from terms of what do we want to have for our consumers. I think it starts with us as consumers too. Being a little bit more willing to maybe it doesn't exactly have to look this way. It's okay if it's a little bit larger, a little bit smaller from that standpoint. But I think it's the whole culture that we've gotten into as consumers that's driving the retailers, that's driving it back to the farms from the supply chain. How do you address it? I'm not sure how we completely address it, but I think it probably takes a lot of education and a lot of just culture and training about our sustainability.
All right, thank you so much, Jack. All right, that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for tuning in. As I said, we will send out the recording and the deck sometime in the next few days. And thank you, Jack, again for sharing a wonderful presentation with us.
Okay, thank you.